Okay, guys, this is going to be a really quick presentation on the discovery of cells. Again, just remember that Robert Hooke in 1665 was one of the first to see actual cells on a microscope. He actually looked at cork, which is a plant tissue found in the bark of trees, and he noticed that it had a honeycomb appearance, as you can see there on the right. He called these little boxes cells, which means little rooms in Latin. So he thought cells were only found in plants and fungi and not animals. Actually, that first set of cells, or first slide that he examined, believe it or not, they were already dead cells. He later saw live cells, but those first couple of samples, those were actually dead. Okay, Anton van Leeuwenhoek in 1673, he was able to look at pond scum under a microscope, and he identified what he called animalcules, meaning little animals. He also looked at blood, tartar from his teeth, bacteria, and yeast. So as we discussed yesterday, cell theory has three different parts. Number one, all organisms are made up of or composed of one or more cells. If it's one cell, then it's called a unicellular organism, and this includes amoeba and paramecium and yeast. If it has more than one cell, it's called multicellular, and this includes all animals and plants. Two, the second part of cell theory is that the cell is the basic unit of life in all living things, regardless of what it is. If it has a cell, therefore it is living. And then thirdly, lastly, all cells come from existing cells. Cells just don't appear. There are also four similarities between all types of cells. Number one, all cells have a cell membrane. Two, all cells have hereditary material. This means that they all have some kind of DNA. Three, all cells have cytoplasm and organelles. Cytoplasm is really just that jelly-like substance that all the organelles or the organs of the cell float around in. And lastly, all cells have small size. It actually takes 50 cells to make up the dot in the letter I, and there are over 100 trillion cells that make up you. So this next topic can be a little bit tricky, but I want to try to address this as best I can in this format, and then I'll address it again when I return to class. The reason cells can't be too big is because as it gets larger, it needs more food and it's going to produce more waste. This doesn't seem like an issue, except that these materials that need to move into and out of the cell have to go through the cell membrane. There's our issue. As the cell gets larger, it's going to take up more space, but it also needs more surface area to take in more food and remove that waste. The inside volume of the cell is going to grow faster than the outside area. And the problem with that is either the cell is not going to be able to get enough food through that cell membrane, or it's not going to be able to get rid of enough waste. Either way, the cell is going to die if it gets to be too large. Again, we'll go over this in more detail in class, but there is an activity on today's worksheet that may help you better understand this. There are many kinds of cells in multicellular organisms, and there's a reason for that. All of these different types of cells are going to specialize in a certain area. And for that reason, they can actually perform lots of jobs. So you have muscle cells that specialize in moving muscles. You have eye cells that specialize in eyes, brain cells, and so on and so forth. That's why it's good to be multicellular. Okay, your cells can perform many different types of jobs. There are two different types of cells, and these are kind of broad, overarching types. There's prokaryotic cells, and then there are eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells, these are bacteria, and they're pretty neat. They are the world's smallest cells. They don't have a nucleus, but they do have that hereditary material, that DNA that we talked about before. They have a cell wall and they have a cell membrane, as you can see in that picture there on the right. Now, there are some neat things about this prokaryotic cell. One thing is that tail. It's called a flagellum, and it's actually used to transport it. It's kind of like a propeller in a boat. Another type of cell is the eukaryotic cell. Eu actually means true. So this is a true karyote or a true kernel, meaning it has a nucleus. It's far more complex. There's a whole lot more to it. It's 10 times larger than the prokaryotic cell, so it's pretty big. It makes up plants, animals, fungi, and protists, so it makes up most of what we know. And it has a nucleus and other organelles, and it also has DNA, but it has more DNA than the bacteria cells or the prokaryotic cells that we saw before. All cells, or I should say, all types of eukaryotic cells have a cell membrane, and some even have a cell wall. For example, plants have a cell wall, whereas animal cells don't. Okay, so if we were to look at the two types of cells side by side, you can see that there are quite a few differences. The prokaryotic cell, pro meaning before, and karyote meaning kernel, meaning this is what it would look like before it has some kind of kernel or before that nucleus. The DNA is just floating around in some kind of goopy mess. The DNA, that's that purple, looks like shoelaces or spaghetti. It's all wound up there in the middle. Whereas in a eukaryotic cell, all the DNA is nice and tightly located within that nucleus. You can also see in the prokaryotic cell that there are very few organelles. It has ribosomes, but not a whole lot else. Whereas in the eukaryotic cell, there are a lot of different organelles there. There are quite a few differences between the two types of cells. We are going to be focusing our attention simply on eukaryotic cells because they're more, well, I find them more interesting and there's a lot more detail to examine. But just so you're aware, there are the two different types, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. Again, we are going to be going over this in more detail, but for now, this should give you a pretty good understanding of differences between the two.